Good morning.
Good morning.
Could you begin by telling us your name, where you were born, and where you grew up?
My name is Linton Garner. I was born in a little town called Montclair, New Jersey, just outside of Newark. I grew up there until I was 11 and then came here to Canada in 1964. Settled here in Montreal in the suburb of LaSalle. We came here because my father was a jazz musician and he got a contract at Rockhead's Paradise nightclub, which at the time was the largest jazz club in Canada. And we were supposed to go back after the contract, which was I think 2 years or something like that. And I have now, this year, in 2024, I'm celebrating my 60th anniversary being here.
Great. What did you do in the years in the 60s and 70s prior to getting involved with the English-speaking community?
Well, I went through the English, school system like everybody else, and went through Dawson College and McGill, and worked in various little jobs until I was in college, when I first became aware of working in the community. I worked for the old Federation of Catholic Charities, which then became Catholic Community Services and now is, I believe, Collective Community Services, where I worked in a summer camp. During the summer, I got paid a whole $500 for the summer back in 1971, and came back from that experience, having had a wonderful experience, knowing that I wanted to work with young people, knowing that I wanted to work with youth, knowing that I wanted to be in some way working in community. And the Federation of Catholic Charities was one of those organizations that was a part of the old English community social services structure. It was one of those organizations. It was called a Red Feather organization back in the day, and it involved places like the Federation, but Child Welfare Services, the Negro Community Center, Tyndale St. George. There were a number of community organizations or institutions within the community that were a part of what was the charitable network within the English-speaking community. And so I got introduced into that milieu mainly because of that first experience and coming back and trying to work at other youth organizations. Worked at Kingston Community Center down in Villemard. After that, coaching basketball. Working in other organizations that had youth services with YMCAs, University Settlement Community Center, which used to be out on St. Urban Street, working with youth, and mainly working in the English-speaking community on in a community basis.
How did you get involved with Alliance Quebec, and what years did you work there?
My involvement in Alliance Quebec actually came through my work with the YMCA. I had worked on a juvenile diversion program out in the West Island with a gentleman by the name of Russ Williams. He's a former MNA who at the time ran a youth program that worked with kids in what we call in conflict at the time. It was an effort to be able to keep young people who happened to have difficulties or having trouble in the community to stay in the community and not be labeled as a part, of the, as a juvenile delinquent or whatever, and then be into the system, as it were. The YMCA at the time in the West Island had organized that program along with a number of other programs that were designed to do that, working with authorities in the community, the police, the cities, and so on, and even organized what they then called the Juvenile Court Citizens Committee, which involved the community in trying to help adjudicate issues when young people got in trouble. And I had worked there for a number of years and then left and worked at the old Unity Boys and Girls Club. And then one day Russ Williams called me and said, look, we have a position open at Alliance Quebec for a community organizer. And I became the community organizer for what was called the Southwest chapter of Alliance Quebec at the time. The Southwest chapter essentially beginning at Point St. Charles and running throughout to Lachine, Dorval, but then the West Island wasn't really a part of that work that that was a part of my chapter, at the time, and started working or organizing in the English-speaking community around language rights, which had been, a different and interesting new, chapter for me.
And what years did you work there?
I worked there in the beginning of the 80s, right through almost to the end of the 90s, where I was then tapped to do some other work by working up in Cotoneige, working for Project Genesis, which was a storefront or organization that was organized to work specifically with the Jewish community at the time. It was a project that was started by Professor Jim Torchiner at McGill University, that looked at the aging population in the Jewish community, mostly centered in Cotoneige. It had followed the migration. The earlier Jewish community had been up in the St. Lawrence and area, but had then migrated over through to Cotoneige, again because housing was cheaper and so on. And my ex-wife, who was from the Jewish community, used to call Cotoneige Bubby Land, meaning where her grandmother lived and grandfather lived. But the storefront operation worked with a variety of communities there, because many people were experiencing housing difficulties. More low-income communities. I think at the time there were some 86 different languages that were spoken in the community. Project Genesis provided information and services to all communities, particularly around housing, some legal issues. There was a legal clinic. And as well, we're a part of what was the Cotoneige Community Council, where we got together with other community organizations and CLSCs and institutions to try to improve the quality of life for members of that community. And then I got a call again from Russ Williams about becoming the organizer or the coordinator for access to English language services at the old, what was then, what are now called CISs, or but the one that was for the Montreal region, Region 6, to look after the implementation of the access plans, the first access plans, which interestingly enough started in Alliance Quebec back in the day when I first started working. And this, I didn't get there until probably the late 80s, early 90s. But in those days, Russ Williams had been the Director of Health and Social Services for Alliance Quebec. And there was a table there called the Region 6, which is Montreal is designated as Region 6, on the Health and Social Services, I think, the municipal plans for all of Quebec, it's Region 6. And that regrouped all those organizations, those major organizations, Ville Marie Social Services at the time, Youth Horizons, Catholic Community Services, all the organizations that worked in health and social services, to look at how we could be able to continue to assure that the English-speaking community would be able to get services, health and social services in their own language. Because this was after the PQ had come to power, had changed the status quo, if you will, around where services were available and where they were available in English. And if we look at the development of the Health and Social Services Network, and particularly in terms of CLSCs, they had developed in the east end of Montreal in the beginning, because that's where they thought the lowest socioeconomic indicators were, and then evolved their way west. So the English-speaking community wasn't used to going to CLSCs for services. They had mainly been sticking to the institutions that they knew, and for all intents and purposes, that was things like Royal Vic, the Montreal General, other major hospitals in the area, the Catherine Booth, the Reddy Memorial, those kinds, and didn't use the CLSCs. And so the CLSC, were not used to receiving the English-speaking community, and therefore, in many cases, weren't ready or prepared to do so. So the regional access plans were designed to be able to give a plan to the Organization of Health and Social Services, the network, a way in which to be able to provide those services. And it went through a variety of issues, from frontline services and reception, and as well as to what kind of professional services could be expected, within there. And you went to different ones that could provide the different services, in your language. But it also meant, working with the long-term care, centers, the CHSLDs, the senior homes, the major hospitals as well, and anything else that was in the public, in the public network that was provided for, all citizens, in the region. Similarly, there were, people that were placed in the other regions in Quebec that had coordinated jobs, just like myself. And we worked with these larger institutions to try to be able to help them understand where the community was, the English-speaking community was, what were their needs, and then looking at which ways, along with the Ministry of Health and Social Services, how they could be served, and what that would mean, and then certainly that they would, perform up to their requirements in terms of providing the adequate level of health and social services that the whole community needed.
Now, this is after your work with Alliance Quebec, right?
This is after, yeah, but the origination of things was back at Alliance Quebec, because actually, Russ Williams, helped almost design and create the access plans. Alliance Quebec was very instrumental in doing that. At the time, under the leadership of the executive director was, Von Dowry, Michael Goldblum, and Eric Maldoff were a part of the organization of that. Russell Copeman and Jeff Kelly, all these people who went on to have important places within the government, within the community, had all been collected and put together to to work on these issues. I even had my old high school principal, Mr. Ian Trasler, who was a part of the education, who ran the education department, who was also instrumental in terms of looking at the implications for the changes in the law on the English speaking community. And then later on, I had something to do with that as well. But that's where my training ground was. These were very dedicated people who, understood at the time that the shifting of the language emphasis, what that meant for the English-speaking community, not just in terms of their place or feeling their place, but what it actually meant day to day in terms of the delivery of services, whether they were educational, health, or social services, or any other type of, any other government services as well, and what that meant for. And so Alliance Quebec, in organizing itself, created chapters in different regions. There was the Outaouais Alliance, where the community I live now, out in Gatineau. But there were also, I think there were some 11 chapters, and stretching from Baie-Comeau, right through down to, Hemingsford, and out into the eastern townships, and there were regional organizations that were folded into them. The Townshippers is an organization that has existed for a long time, in the, out in the townships, the eastern townships, that had existed for a long time, that provided English language services and guidance to, services for the English-speaking community. It was a real rallying point. Still functions, in that way, even though the landscape has changed a little bit. There, like I said, up in Baie-Comeau, up in Gaspé, there were groups like CASA and so on who were folded into Alliance Quebec, and they represented what we called the off-island representation. And we'd get together. There was representation on the board of Alliance Quebec from all of those groups. And then we'd have our annual conferences. And part of my responsibilities at that time, in terms of those regional conferences, was to organize the youth wing of Alliance Quebec. And we started to bring in young people from all over the place. One of the people I can think of is Charlene Sullivan, who runs the Neighbors program up in the Iabitzibi. I got her interested when she was, 15 years old. I think she just retired last year, from doing that. But we brought these young people together. It was, it was an important opportunity to bring young people from the extended regions in particular. Bay Como used to bring like their graduating high school class and so on, to introduce them to other elements within the English-speaking community. And many of them have gone on to, to be pillars in their community and working with English language organizations like Charlene Sullivan, who ran the Neighbors program for many years up there. So those were important opportunities for to coalesce the English-speaking community, for the English-speaking community to take stock of what was the reality that was going on, and then making sure that they're, in terms of the reorganization, the changing landscape, that they were not forgotten, that they were included in as part of the planning, to be able to assure that they would get the kinds of services that they were guaranteed, under our charters, and as well under the regional development plans for all kinds of networks, within Quebec, and making sure that no matter where we were, so Central Quebec, up in Quebec City region and so on, like I said, Gaspé, Bay Como, townships down in on the south side, at the time, I can't remember what the name of the organization was, that was working with the English-speaking community out there, but had very strong leadership and identified as an English-speaking community, wanted to assure that they weren't going to lose their rights. And so Alliance Quebec was able to bring those groups together. Wasn't always in harmony. There was lots of disagreement about the plans. And as Alliance Quebec evolved, there became more radical elements, if you will, or more aggressive elements there, which also created some other difficulties within that. And by the time some of that element came along under the late William Johnson, I was back at Alliance Quebec, as a director of health and social services. But I had been a part of the board before that. I had worked in a variety of ways with Alliance, but those kinds of changes necessitated other types of action and work, and we had done things on signs. I think the signs was the big issue, in brown shoes versus Quebec and so on. That kind of legislation, mobilized people, to be able to say, look, we're losing our sort of public face as an English-speaking community. Within Quebec, and we need to do something about it. We're a part of this community. We've been here. We've been a part of the development of the Quebec, and we have a good-sized citizenry here that continues to need services, and that's what happened.
Could you talk a bit about some of the work that you did specifically in the Southwest as a community organizer?
As a community organizer, the idea was to be able to get to know, the community in particular. So I was reaching out, sometime, having local meetings. We were housed in I don't know, I guess up in the gym, almost of a church that I used to visit, on Fifth Avenue. There was a strong in Verdun. There was a strong English-speaking community there, and those were the first communities, parts where, I started to organize, getting out into the community, understanding the network, how the community organized itself, meeting with the different groups, church groups, the Boys and Girls Clubs. There was a, Dawson Boys and Girls Club, down there on Woodland Avenue, that provided a lot of services, working with, groups in Point St. Charles, at the time, which was also a more socioeconomically depressed community. And then, because of the evolution of the community, English, that movement west brought me into LaSalle and Lachine and Dorval. So it was getting to know key people in those communities and working on issues that they identified as problems for them. So as I talked before about the CLSCs not knowing the community and the community not trusting those services to be able to be provided in English. For instance, in Verdun, nobody ever wanted to be taken to the Verdun hospital. There were stories of people jumping out of the ambulance en route to say, no, don't take me there. And for all intents and purposes, for that western section, that southwest chapter, their hospital was the Ready Memorial, which is down here on Atwater and René Lévesque. So that was the hospital that served that community, rather than the Verdun General, which was down on the lakeshore, the LaSalle General as well, which is down on Champlain and LaSalle. Lachine General Hospital had a little bit better reputation with with that community there, because it was in the part of the community where the English-speaking community mostly resided, in the upper avenues versus the lower, the lower avenues. I'm turning in terms of numbers. So if you were sort of above 30th Avenue, you went to the, you went to that hospital, and you can get services in English. I remember even as a kid in high school, I worked as a dishwasher there. So. So it was getting to know those communities, what their concerns were, and holding kitchen meetings, bringing people together, organizing activities, and working with the different community organizations to get an opportunity to talk about to talk with people about what their concerns were, and then bringing them back to Central, not only in terms of the central offices, which at the time was down on Crescent Street, but as well coalescing the community into, taking action, making sure that they use the services. Because if you don't use the services, you lose it. And then, so when we talked with CLSC officials, said, well, look, nobody ever asked for services in English. That's because people didn't come, because they didn't trust them. So we had to create, a collaboration with the community. The community needed to be introduced to those institutions, and the institutions needed to be introduced to the community. And slowly that, that started to work itself out, where people felt more confident about going to, those services and using those services. But at the same time, equally, was that those access plans, which at one time in my second stint with Alliance Quebec, we had to take them to a court. We had to do a writ of mandamus when this was under the regime of the Péquistes, because they had not passed the access plans. The access plans needed cabinet approval. And without cabinet approval, the institutions themselves were not forced to be to put those services in place. They weren't obliged. I don't mean forced, but they weren't obliged. The administrators were talking about, we're following what the law says. And the law didn't require, because they had not been passed by the cabinet, they had not, enforced those regulations within the system.
Okay. What was the place of labor, workers, working class groups, or groups like BlackRock in Verdun that was more, sort of
extremely
with Alliance Quebec? How did those groups interact?
Well, there certainly was an arts and culture element. Even though there was a large preoccupation on the services that were provided by government, making sure that the community in itself could, get what was guaranteed or was supposed to be guaranteed to them. But we understood as well that the support of the cultural network within the community was important as well. There were people that Alliance Quebec were dedicated to working with on the culture side, the arts and culture side, and on many occasions they were used in the way in which, when we brought people together, we could demonstrate what our culture was as an English-speaking community. People always talk about, what is a culture? The English don't have any culture. It wasn't something that people sort of identified like they identified the French culture with, and so there was a struggle for artists to get recognized in the Quebec milieu. And there were lots of opportunities for, Alliance Quebec to present grant propositions when we spoke to, commissions, parliamentary commissions and so on about that. We worked with the Montreal, Council, Arts and Culture Council.
Tell us a little bit about Black Rock Group, your involvement there.
Well, Black Rock was a culture and a stipend in the community in Verdun. It represented the roots of the Irish community that had partly settled in that area. It went from Griffintown to which was close to Little Burgundy, and migrated again. It seemed like always the English-speaking community migrated west from their origins, and it was an important cultural piece, and it provided a place for young people, amongst them like a guy I went to school with at Dawson, David Fenario, to start to organize and be a part of that process. He had written a play called Balconville, which was certainly well celebrated in the English-speaking community, and had tours, I believe, at the Centaur Theatre and so on. And he was a big name, and he was a writer, a poet, and there were other individuals within the community, musical artists, who went through there as a part of one of the only venues for the English-speaking community on the arts and cultural level to express themselves, to be able to provide, to find a public forum, to develop their talents and display the culture that is in the English-speaking community.
Was Alliance Quebec involved with Black Rock in any way?
Not in terms of that I remember in terms of a real formal connection, but certainly there was an awareness and the importance that that Black Rock and what it meant historically, in terms of the building of the Victoria Bridge and all that, but as well what it represented culturally. And I think we need to really understand in terms of how the English-speaking community has organized itself, in that sense that it is considered most of those groups that were not Francophone at the time as a part of the Anglophone community. So that meant the Greek community, the Italian community, and so on, because of the fact that before Bill 101, all immigrants, all newly arrived, anybody who was English-speaking, went into the English-speaking educational system. And so at one time, we're all considered as a part of what you would call the Anglophone community. But under the definition, though, of an Anglophone is somebody that has British origins, and so a Francophone is one that has French origins. And so somebody like myself, an American, being Black, and many other communities whose mother tongues were not, or origins weren't a part of that, were lumped into that. And before Alliance Quebec even organized, there used to be something called the Council of Quebec Minorities, of which the English-speaking community was a part of, but separated themselves from that group, withdrew, because they didn't consider themselves a minority. And that was always a kind of a rub between minority communities and the English-speaking community. The English-speaking community didn't feel that it had any of the same kinds of issues, immigration issues, didn't have the discriminatory issues that some of the other communities face, or settlement issues and so on. And so they thought that their fight was different than the fight of minorities. And so at certain points in time, there was a bit of resentment in terms of other minority communities, East Indian community, Black community, Greek and Italian. There was a difference in many of those ways, particularly the issues sometimes around the Italian community and what happened with the education system and so on. There was support from Alliance Quebec, but I don't think at a certain point in time that Italian community didn't feel that the English-speaking community was on, was on the same page in that. And there were distinctions. You'll have to talk to other people who were at the decision-making level at the time of which I wasn't. But, as being a part of the community and organizing, some of those distinctions were palpable. And there was a mistrust, and that wasn't, and hasn't, to a certain degree, hasn't been entirely resolved in terms of other minorities in Quebec. And that minorities in Quebec facing some of the other issues they have around discrimination, equity, and inclusion, don't see the English-speaking community as a part of that,
Would you say there was also a class issue? Like, was Alliance Quebec seen as this kind of upper-class organization, or was that not an issue?
I would probably think so, in the sense that, the people who were involved in organizing that, had political interest, had political clout, were able to generate funds, for support, represented some of the elite institutions, the Royal Vic, the General, the Ready Memorial. These were people that had those kinds of connections. The Region 6 table at the time was headed by Mary Kelly, who is the mother of Jeff Kelly and the grandmother of Greg Kelly. The people who were around the table institutionally, represented, New Horizons, Grace Dart, Ville Marie Social Services, and you didn't find the Catholic, the Federation of Catholic Charities. You didn't find minority individuals as a part of that structure. Even the Negro Community Center wasn't a part of that Region 6 table at the time, even though its role within the Black community and Little Burgundy altogether was extremely important in terms of its role of health and social services, culture, and recreational services, down in Little Burgundy.
So how did Black Quebecers fit into the whole English-speaking community organizational landscape, and how did that change over the years? Now you're saying in the early years,
in the early years, it was just taken for granted that we were part of it because we were in the English language education system.
Right.
And there wasn't a real reach out from that community, from the English-speaking community to the Black community. That remained for years. Many of our leaders in our community, people like Clarence Bain, Dan Phillips, Noel Alexander, who represented the Jamaican Association, Dan Phillips, who ran the Ligue des Noirs, Clarence Baines, who ran the Quebec Board of Black Educators, and many other of the community organizations, the Black Community Associations, NCC, weren't a part of the roundtables, weren't a part of the planning, weren't included, in those issues. And so therefore, they felt, the minorities felt that this was not a trusted partner. They were not going to be working in their interest. They were working in the interest of what was called the so-called elites. And from perspective of the Black community, they're saying, well, hey, you guys are not, facing, employment discrimination, difficulties with the police, getting streamed in the education system. The Quebec Board of Black Educators started because the PSBGM, the largest, English language school board at the time, when it received new immigrants from the West Indies, put them in a streaming situation whereby they put them in the general stream of education, which was just practical to get out, but didn't provide you for secondary education. The Quebec Board of Black Educators had to force the PSBGM to develop programming, summer schooling, for instance, to be able to get more blacks into university, which was a part of the issues that our community had been screaming for. And as a matter of fact, myself and many others who came out of that were a part of that first class in 1970 when I graduated from high school. And a summer sort of school, if you will, to augment our marks to be able to get us into CJEP or university. That was the first That was the last year that you were able to go directly from high school to university here in Quebec in 1970. After that, you had to go through the CEGEP system. But, but it was a situation, for instance, one of my, and I think he was my well-meaning, my principals, had been driving me and a couple of other black kids to a basketball game, and he said, "You guys shouldn't even think about going to university." He said, "Nobody's going to hire you." He understood from that standpoint. He said, "You need to go into the trades, get yourself a trade, and you can make yourself a living." So the prevailing orientation about our community and other minority communities was that we weren't post-secondary education ready, or this wasn't a desire on our part. I actually had somebody once tell me from another community that, hey, you don't have the same concerns in the black community about education as we do in our community. And that was the perception that was going on. But at this time, these communities were just trying to survive. They didn't have employment. They were working 2 and 3 jobs. They were in entry-level, employment. A lot of the black community worked. The Little Burgundy community developed, after at the beginning of the 20th century because of the trains. That's why it was settled near the train yards in Little Burgundy. The porters, it was considered to be a good job if you could get a job as a porter. And despite all the miseries that they went through, it was something that was at least steady kind of employment.
So what has changed for the black community within the English-speaking organizational landscape, if anything? I mean, is it still the same issue today, or is there better integration now?
I think there's still somewhat of the same kind of issues. The black community said, look, we have to take care of our own. And so we developed, at the time, maybe the NCC, the Negro Community Center, and UNIA, the United Negro Improvement Association, which was started by Marcus Garvey, were the mainstays, and the church, right? The church network, particularly Union United down on Delisle Street at the bottom of Atwater there, near Atwater Market, played major roles. But then the new arrivals, those who had come from black-centered countries, for instance, didn't accept the idea of being a Negro and wanted to, and say, look, as long as they keep us in that position in the majority community, and mostly speaking about the English community at the time, they're not going to do anything for us. So we started to develop Cotoneige Black Community Association, NDG Black Community Association, South Shore Black Community Association. It's the first time that people started to really identify as black, as being an acceptable, at certain points before that, being called black or blackie or something like that was a pejorative thing. And now the community started to take it over as a positive image. And then you had some of the cultural associations identifying itself, Jamaican Association, Trinidadian, Barbados House, those kind of things. And then other organizations that were serving particular interests, like the Quebec Board of Black Educators, there was the Black Medical Association and so on. The community organized itself to take care of itself, and at times didn't care what the English-speaking community was doing, because as far as they were concerned, the English-speaking community didn't care about them. And over time, there, as Alliance Quebec waned, and we started to develop with the community table, then up into what is now, QCGN and the likes. There has been a spattering of, of representation, but our goals haven't always been aligned, and we haven't always been included in the representation that the QCGN or other organizations that speak for the English-speaking community, present in terms of, the preoccupations and concerns of the community. And in some cases, the black community hasn't wanted the English-speaking community to speak for us as a community. And so there's always been a bit of a rub, and I don't believe that it's, that's over, because we also had trouble with English-speaking community institutions. Ville Marie Social Services, for instance, now Batchel. Still the issue of taking black kids out of the homes more often than they took, white kids. Even in their own surveys at the time, Ville-Marie found out that the white social workers, which they were predominantly, were twice as likely to take a black kid out of their home than a white kid. All right, and so there's still a lot of institutional trauma that the community experiences. I was at a grouping last night where people my age are still talking about how that was a traumatic effect for them being shifted and put in through the system. And we imagine that's for anybody who goes through the system. But the idea that the English-speaking community was looking out after our interests, understood who we were, understood what our needs were, and were responding to that, in many cases was far from the truth. And certainly people were unaware of and weren't even interested in what was doing, other than what we could be as part of the political fodder, to amplify numbers and, for which those organizations could then get funding, big money, to be able to work with the community as a whole as a definition of an Anglophone community or an English-speaking community, but not particular in terms of working with the specific groups within it.
Now, you worked in Alliance Quebec in the 80s and 90s. Did you do some bridge building between the black community and the Alliance Quebec?
Yeah, I certainly,
And how successful was that?
Well, in some cases it was because we got some of the leaders, people like, Noel Alexander and Dan Phillips and Clarence Baines, to be a part of some of the boards and the representation and so on. We got some understanding about the changing needs on the educational level and some of the settlement issues, and that they were also English speaking, so also required services. So at sometimes could define some of that. There were some some efforts to work with the Black network on some of those issues, but I don't think anybody would really say in terms of the Black community that that Alliance Quebec was their friend, and there was a certain amount of mistrust of me, in terms of my intervention in those communities because of the organization that I represented. It wasn't until I was later when I got into in terms of the regional access plans, when I was working for the CS, at the time, where we could get attention paid to the Black community in terms of the organization of services of the institutions towards the English-speaking community, particularly in areas like NDG, Côte-des-Neiges, La Salle, and so on, where there was a more, the South Shore, where there was a more prominence of the Black community, and they began to get included in that. But on a political level, we never really got a chance to really establish eye-to-eye, a certain recognition of equality, if we would say, in terms of the importance that the Black community played in the definition of who the English-speaking community was.
I'm going to take a step back. You mentioned earlier that there was a mistrust of the CLSC system by the English-speaking community as a whole,
yes,
not just the Black community. Could you explain why that mistrust existed, in your opinion?
Well, again, as I said, the CLSC network was first organized in the eastern part of the city of Montreal, where they thought the demographic and the socioeconomic indicators were poorer than for the English-speaking community. All right, so they organized east and went to west. It took a long time for some of those services to be organized. The CLSC on Cavendish and NDG, for instance, when it arrived, there was a certain mistrust of it. But, again, it started to, come around with the presence of the Black community, the English-speaking community, to serve them. But when you first went to a CLSC, you didn't get services in English. There wasn't a requirement for you to get services, in English. They didn't have personnel, staff, who could be able to respond to them. And certainly in terms of the kind of services they organized for seniors, they had community organizers, they had services for mothers or moms and tots and so on. None of them were, seemed to be organized, with the English-speaking community.
Right. So they weren't proactive by offering those services.
Yeah, exactly. So people said, look, I'm not going there. I can't get services there, And so they're, Ville Marie Social Services and the hospitals were the main places that people presented themselves, or other informal organizations like a YMCA, like in the University Settlement Community, like the Boys and Girls Clubs, which were important institutions in the English-speaking community. Had been serving, like the Point St. Charles Boys and Girls Club, had been serving the community, and this is where the community used, used services. When minority communities first develop and the majority doesn't respond to them, they develop their own informal networks, and yes, there was funding and so on, but there were parts of that, still you petitioned the government on its own, you raised funds on your own. You did, the community was much more involved in elaborating and helping elaborating those programs for those organizations within that informal network. And were largely left alone. I'm sure many of the organizers from back in the day could tell you about how they struggled with, in order to be able to get recognition, to be able to get funding for services, to be able to develop services. The church networks as well were extremely important, and even though we were separated by Catholic and Protestant, and certainly the English school boards were separated in that way prior to the changeover from confessional to linguistic school boards, people used the church networks to be able to get the kinds of services that that they needed, and so the reach out. And then of course organizations like the Salvation Army and so on, Red Cross to some extent, those were the organizations that worked with the English-speaking community, and I think even from a certain standpoint were identified as English language organizations. But those developed out of necessity because the institutional network wasn't prepared, wasn't giving services, wasn't prepared to give services, didn't know the English-speaking community enough to be able to respond to them like they had done socio-demographically to the communities in the east of, and the Francophone communities in the east of Montreal.
So what brought you to the Outaouais, and can you describe a little bit the English-speaking community you found there and how it was different from what you do in Montreal?
Well, what brought me to the Outaouais was an old high school friend again by the name of Brian Rock. Brian Rock had been a person that I had worked with. It's funny, I hadn't seen him in many years, and when I worked with Alliance Quebec, he was the head of the chapter up in Baie-Comeau. If you remember when we graduated in high school in the 70s, in the 70s, and when he graduated university, got his teaching degree, they were firing teachers. There were no spaces for teachers, and so you couldn't find a place as a teacher. So he went up to the, up to the eastern region and Baie-Comeau and found a job, became a principal, became a part of that organization of the off-island chapter, all right, and and so we had contact back and forth. He then, when he retired, his children had moved out to the Outaouais. He decided to retire out there and then continue his work with the Outaouais Alliance at the time, and took over the executive director. And then he decided to retire from that, and he reached out to me because we'd both been a part of the Quebec Federation of Home and School Associations, which is a support network for parents within all the English language school boards. I think we have something like 85 different chapters within the the 9 or 10 English language school boards in the province. And I had taken over from him as as president of that association. He'd been the past president. Then he retired from the Regional Association of West Quebecers, and which the Outaouais Alliance became. And he said, "Come on out here. They're looking for an executive director."
What year was that?
That was 2017.
Okay.
And so I came out there to to work in that role. That community is a very interesting community because It has very strong Irish roots. There's parts of the Outaouais you can go up in the western part, and some people still talk with an Irish accent just like they got off the boat. There are classic English communities up there like Shawville, and then as you continue on up, from Rouyn-Noranda, Val-d'Or, and Temiskaming, there are pockets of the English-speaking community, and they're all a part of the Outaouais, sort of Western Quebec. The Western Quebec School Board, serves all of that in the territory as well, and so it was a community that was pretty well connected, although isolated. There had been a really growing population in a part of the Outaouais called Aylmer. Aylmer, Quebec was largely looked at as an English town, but with the amalgamation of three communities, that would be Gatineau, Hull, and Aylmer, that presence became, less. And so, just in terms of sheer numbers. And then, of course, as a community that's more where there are less services or rural services, where the health and social service network isn't as developed or isn't as robust, if you will, as it might be in a larger urban area, and where people are separated by distance. In the Outaouais is the size of Belgium, and so you have a vast area to be able to cover, and there are little pockets of communities there existing who had been there for long periods of time, but weren't necessarily connected, but found informal networks to be able to continue to promote the community. And so through events, fairs and festivals and that kind of stuff, the community get together. But still they needed, representation in terms of voice. And so we started, getting involved in the political scene, helping organize the political debates, for instance, and insisting on, it was pretty good, for instance, that the Outaouais, the Gatineau City Council usually provided and answered questions in English and so on. Our recent debate of the new mayoral candidates, for instance, every one of them spoke English, in terms of responding to questions. And then we were able to develop online services. So for instance, I was the host of a television program on the local cable network, the Videotron network, called City Life for 9 seasons, where we talked exclusively about the English-speaking community. Had individuals, we recognized people that were in the community who had played major roles, all right? And we brought them on weekly to be able to describe what it is that they were doing, what their role was, talk about the history of the community and so on, give people a bit more understanding of we are a collective, we're still here, we have an identity that's distinct in many ways from other English-speaking communities. And even on a socioeconomic, level, some of the poorest indicators of health and social services and economy in the country, all right, are the English-speaking community in the Outaouais. And so there are a variety of ways that we needed to be able to work with the politicians, work with the institutions to be able to continue to assure that there were services that were available for them. The Shawville Hospital, for instance, largely serves the English-speaking community. The Gatineau Hospital and so on are getting better. People are having more confidence in them. But, still people rely on what they know, and, some CLSCs, have started to, working together, but that's what we worked on. We worked on pushing those issues, on bringing out the culture of the community. I produced 3 other television shows in that area. The one that was talking about local artists, there were 2 about local artists. We had a night at the British Hotel, which was the hotel which actually between Montreal and Ottawa was the only hotel for a long time in terms of the development of the region. All right, we talked about the history of it, of the arrival of the English-speaking community around there, beginning of the 1800s, establishing the logging business and so on. and that long history that it had, in terms of development of the region. We wanted to make people aware of both English speakers and French speakers. I can't tell you how many times I got stopped on the street by Francophones who looked at me and said, you got a great program. I didn't know this about the English speaking people, and the English speaking community. I didn't even know in many cases that it existed. It was like the time I went to Baie-Comeau to talk about community learning centers, and part of the stuff that I did for the Ministry of Education. A guy, this one guy told me, he said, I've been working shoulder to shoulder with this guy for 20 years, and he never knew there was an English language high school in Baie-Comeau. And so there was an unfamiliarity with the community. So the desire was to be able to not only connect the community, all right, but to be able to bring more presence to the community, in terms of let the community, the general community, know that we were there, that we had a culture, we had a history, that we were contributing to the development of it, and then to celebrate that, that presence of the community, and make sure that the community was active in the elections, municipally, school board elections, those kinds of things, to be able to get them more fully, involved and engaged in the community. Because if you don't show up, nobody knows you're there. And decisions are made by the people who do show up. And so if we can get to be a part of that. So we got to be invited to be a part of the table de consultation, Vivre Ensemble, where the city of Gatineau was trying to bring more parts of the different elements of the community together. I participated on the regional access committee. In terms, there was a committee there established with the CIS or the CISO now they call them, to assure that there were more English language services, and worked with organizations like Connections, which is headed by a woman by the name of Danielle Landry, and which is a part of the Community Health and Social Services Network. We, trying to make sure that those, they were supported, and that we were doing things that, were going to help them develop their goals and their aims.
What do you think is the biggest challenge, or one of the biggest challenges that's facing the English-speaking community in the Outaouais, and what did ROC do to sort of address that challenge?
I think it really was having a voice, and being a part of the planning process, if you will, and the organization of the of the community itself, and the development, its socioeconomic development, its health and social services development, educational development. And I think with some of the leaders that had been there before, like the late Jim Shaw, who headed up the school board, the Western Quebec School Board, for many years, working with individuals from Charleville, like Chris Judd, people who were very important in making sure they were involved in the agricultural sector, within the community. So there was a recognition of the English language farmers and so on. It was really making sure that as you look at the region, the English-speaking community isn't forgotten. At whatever level, things are being organized and so on. So that meant politically, socially, economically, institutionally. And I think we helped in being able to create that presence, through the television program, through supporting some of the programs that we did. We had a cooking program. We had two programs that showcased artists, local artists, in their way. Being connected to the local school board, getting our people involved on the governing boards within their schools, getting elected to the school board council, being active in the political parties there. The federal government was lucky that there was support for the Liberals in that region. The English-speaking community came out and supported them. They, out of the 4 or 5 territories in there, they were English-speaking people that were elected. And well, at least Liberals that were elected, and that And that was important because the English-speaking community is more identified with the Liberal Party than any other. You know, I think on a political level, it seems, at least in that region. And then at the local MNA level, we supported those MNAs who looked to support the English-speaking community, you know, with whom we had a dialogue, with whom we were able to make them understand about the necessities that the government be equal in its distribution of resources, or at least proportional in terms of the distribution of resources to the English-speaking community as well as to, you know, the larger Francophone community.
Is there anything else you would like to share for the record? You know, any kind of takeaways of your many years of involvement in English-speaking community organizing?
Well, I think, you know, I think in general, we need to be able to identify as a community more than necessarily a linguistic group. We're sort of not going to win the language wars in that sense. But what we can argue about is being citizens of this province, having the rights to all of the services that the provincial government organizes and provides for the community, and assuring that those are accessible and understandable, so that we can fully participate within that. Certainly, we think some of the recent hijinks over Bonjour High and the 6 month limit and traditional Anglos and all those things are stupid, on the face of it, but still we have real communities, real people who are not getting their services as seniors, as new mothers, as new arrivals in the community, as young people. Our employment levels aren't the same as as other as the majority community and so on. And I think we need to continue to rally around those issues that we deserve as citizens who contribute to the development of this province. All the benefits that should be accrued to us that are organized by any government. I think we need to have a stronger presence from the federal government to protect the English-speaking community in that way. And we have not always felt that the Official Languages Act has been our friend here in Quebec. I think it's been a much better friend to Francophones outside of Quebec than it has been to the English-speaking population inside Quebec. And I don't think you're going to find much argument about that, anywhere in Quebec about that. Things are happening, are improving. We were part of the discussion on the modernization of the Official Languages Act, but we still don't think it went far enough, and we're continuing to worry about Bill C-13, in terms of what, the consequences that could possibly overspill from that, and seemingly lack of understanding that we are here as a community as well as the Francophone community. So I think people need to work on identifying the community and working on the structures that we need to solidify us, to make sure that our presence continues here, because we have a tremendous brain drain of young people, particularly in the region where I live now, where we're just across the river from Ontario, where pay is better, where people who have French language experience are sought after and so on. The Heritage College there where the nursing program is, hardly any of those students who graduate from there get jobs as nurses in Quebec. And that's in part because of the language test, but also because the pay is better and their knowledge of French is sought after, in that region, in the Outaouais, in that bigger Ottawa region. So we need to work on those things that are going to sustain us as a community. There needs to be more unity around that. We can't always have this as a political discussion. We really have to have this as a roots community discussion, and saying, what is it that we need to sustain us? How do we need to do that? And how do we, assure that future? And I don't think, and I know organizations are making their efforts, but I don't think there seems to be enough of that collective argument, that collective planning to help us assure some of that sustainability for our kids and our grandchildren.
Thanks a lot, Linton.